a large part of the task of the media is simply to direct people away from issues. So keep them focused on sitcoms and, spectator sports or something, anything, as long as they don't get involved in something that might be serious.
And another reason why we decided to take bicycles was to see at a grassroots level what sort of destruction was going on, how the people were living in the forest, what they thought of the forest, and to see it in a level that was not necessarily through the eyes of corporate businesses.
The situation in Nicaragua got worse and worse through the 60s, and in the late 60s and in the early 70s, there began to be a response, an organized effort on the part of many different sectors of Nicaraguan society to resist the violence of the dictatorship.
Good evening and welcome to Dead Air Live. My name is Steve Sherblum, and tonight's episode is A Palestinian Perspective. Throughout the Middle East crisis, which is still going on in terms of epidemics, homelessness, and the violent occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the vast majority of voices in the American media have been white men talking about how easy or how difficult it would be for the military to accomplish the president's goals. And very little time or consideration has been given to Arab perspectives on these very complicated issues. Tonight, we provide a forum for the American Arab community to present an alternative point of view. The following are excerpts from an evening of politics, food, music, and dancing that was held on March 2nd. Stay with us.
The Society of Arab Students tonight with the Committee for Democratic Palestine are here to shed some light on this conflict, hoping you will have a better understanding of it. And now I would like to introduce Khalid Ismail from the Committee for Democratic Palestine.
Good evening, dear sisters and brothers. As you know, the Committee for Democratic Palestine has held annual events of this nature for the past 10 years. And some years were really rough on us and on our Palestinian and Arab communities, especially the years of the Israeli invasion and occupation of Lebanon and the 3 years of the Palestinian Intifada. But this year has inflicted on us and on our community a particular kind of emotion and mental hardship. This Gulf War involved the country we live in against a dear part of our national homeland, Iraq, adding to our people suffering. In the war zone, our Arab community was subjected to discrimination and harassment by federal authorities, not to mention the double standard that was exposed. Most of you here tonight know exactly what I'm talking about. Through our interaction with you and others in our Arab community, Arab American community, we became aware of the mixed feelings about holding such an event. Many wanted this event to be a strictly mourning mood, but we decided that in spite of our anxiety and remorse, we had no choice but to get together as we are tonight, to exchange our strengths as a community and to be loyal to the dedication and aspirations of our people. Aspiration and dedication of our people throughout the Arab world, especially our people in Iraq and Palestine. I hope that you would agree that we made the right decision by holding this event. I'm confident that your presence and participation tonight would render our effort in supporting the Palestinian Intifada a success. Thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you, Hisham. And now I'd like to introduce Hisham and Furbat al-Watan from Washington.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Palestinian Academic Freedom Network, an organization designed to reopen the Palestinian universities in the Gaza and West Bank, it's a pleasure to introduce Professor Nasir Arouri, a prominent Palestinian who is a professor of political science at Southeastern Mass Universities. Professor Arouri is a constant source and invaluable support and inspiration for our community. Welcome, Professor Arouri.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, friends. I'm very glad to be with you. This is not a very happy occasion, but I think that it is a time for reflection. This is not the first time that we find ourselves in a situation like this. It happened many times in the past century, and it certainly happened also quite a few times in our life. Tonight I want to take a few minutes just to review the events of what happened in the past few months, and particularly what happened in the past few weeks. By declaring war on Iraq, George Bush has set the world on a course of unprecedented peril. The massive and savage bombardment of that cradle of civilization and the decimation of Baghdad, the pride and joy of 200 million Arabs and nearly 1 billion Muslims around the world, will undoubtedly trigger devastating upheavals to redress the persistent injustice that have been long tolerated and even encouraged by the West. George Bush will probably be known and remembered for generations to come as the new Holago. In case you don't know Holago, he was the grandson of Genghis Khan, who destroyed Baghdad in the year 1258. George Bush will become the butcher of Baghdad, and you must correct the Fuad Ajamis of the world when they attribute this phrase to Saddam Hussein. tell him to be corrected. The onslaught marks a new and dangerous phase in the ongoing attempt by the West in general, and the US in particular, to impose a scheme that is nothing less than 19th century colonialism revisited, and which is consistent with the US long-standing determination to pursue its advantage in the Middle East, an enterprise George Bush refers to as the unfolding of a new world order, a unipolar world in which American political hegemony and American strategic and economic interests, buttressed by military might, may go unchallenged. A world order based on the intimidation of the Arab world, the intimidation of the Third World, and the intimidation even of America's allies. That's why George Bush went to war in part. The US stance fails to acknowledge the simple historical fact that military force has never succeeded in resolving any crisis in the region, and has instead only sown the seeds for further conflict. The brief American engagement in 1983 on behalf of an unpopular government in Lebanon, coupled with tacit support for Israel's invasion of that country in 1982, were directly responsible for the upsurge of Lebanese resistance, what the West refers to nowadays, what it has been referring to as Shiite terrorism. The coming of the Khomeini regime in Iran traces its descent from the CIA-engineered overthrow of Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953 and the reinstallation of the hated regime of the Shah and his terroristic apparatus. It is a telling irony that the father of General Norman Schwarzkopf, the commander of the US forces in Saudi Arabia, who gave the order to these young pilots to rain terror upon the people of Baghdad and Basra and Nasiriyah and the other cities. His father is the same person who was responsible for training the police force, the Iranian police force in the 1940s, and helped Mossadegh's ouster. So this family has a long history in the Middle East. George Bush has managed to transform what was and must remain a purely local inter-Arab dispute into an international conflict by marshalling support through pressure and bribery, couching his campaign in legalistic and moralistic terms, and stifling all sincere efforts towards achieving resolution within an Arab framework or an international forum. Neither the European community, the French, the Soviets, the Algerians, the Yemenis, the Iranians, the Jordanians, nor the United Nations or the US Congress, all of them reduced to convenient tools for carrying out his intent, were given a chance to entertain any serious prospects for a diplomatic resolution. Forgive me, not all of them, I meant the United Nations and the US Congress, but he managed to ignore all the appeals for diplomacy from the French and the Soviets and the Algerians and the Iranians and the Yemenis and the Jordanians and many others. You remember Iraq's own initiative in late August, when Iraq even dropped the linkage question that became so controversial and said that let us discuss withdrawal. We are willing to withdraw, providing that we can have a negotiated access to the Gulf and providing that we can also discuss the distribution of the Rumaila oil field. And then Iraq came back on January 2nd and even dropped the Rumaila business and the Gulf business and simply said that we are willing to withdraw, providing that the Security Council expresses intent, simply intent, to deal with the matter of destroying the weapons of mass destruction. Obviously, Iraq was referring to the nuclear capacity of Israel, which the United Nations, under the leadership of George Bush, would never even entertain. And then there was the French proposal, you remember, that was made less than 2 days before Bush decided to go to war, that received a categorical rejection, an immediate rejection from George Bush, even at a time that he was talking about a coalition and the UN effort. He did not even have time to consult his so-called coalition. He gave a summary rejection. Such a diplomatic resolution was always at variance. We knew that. It was always at variance with George Bush's aims of crippling Iraq's military and industrial capacity. Kuwait was the pretext. We all know it was simply the pretext that provided a way of affecting these goals, so that Iraq's rising eminence in the Arab world would be negated and its assumption of the responsibilities of deterrence and safeguarding of the Arab world's security vis-à-vis Israel would be prevented. This is the only explanation for George Bush's articulation of the whole issue in zero sum, his personalizing and his distortion of the issue, and his refusal to permit any decisive attempt at resolving it diplomatically. In dealing with symptoms rather than root causes, refusing to define the issue and insisting on Iraq's unconditional capitulation, George Bush guaranteed the failure of diplomacy. George Bush is responsible for a policy whose ramifications will continue to affect billions of people in the Arab and Muslim world and in the US and the West as well. You know, he repeated with monotonous frequency that the conflict was between Saddam, as he put it, Saddam, and the world. He couldn't even pronounce the name. He couldn't even get himself to call a man by his own name appropriately. This is not true, actually. He, George Bush, has, in ways that have never been seen before in recent memory, created a chasm between the American people on the one hand and the Arab people on the other. He had succeeded with cooperation from a compliant US media, which welcomed his muzzle in insulating the average American from the atrocities committed in Iraq, because he demonized Saddam Hussein, and by demonizing Saddam Hussein and by officially certifying him as the new Hitler, the devil incarnate and the personification of all evil, he made it easy to justify the most violent measures against his people, against the Iraqi people and the Arab people. And so the average American person, decorated with yellow ribbon and American flag, praised George Bush for redeeming his honor after the humiliation in Vietnam and in Lebanon, and had no guilt feeling about the more than 100,000 Iraqi victims who fell under the rubble created by the B-52s and the cruise missiles. These people remain anonymous. They lived in bunkers rather than in shelters. But above all, their identity melted. It melted in that pervasive demon-like Saddam, as he put it. In projecting the affair as naked aggression by an egotistical maniac, an aggression not even susceptible to negotiation as George Bush wanted it, the American public has been saved from intellectual hardships and emotional traumas or feelings of guilt. This is what George Bush did. This is the crime which I feel that he committed not only against Iraqi civilians and the Arab nation, but also against the American people. Because through deception, through censorship and distortion, he made everyone who pays taxes in this country an accomplice in crimes of state in the Nuremberg sense. And yet, he is the one who threatens to bring the Iraqis to justice. This is a glimpse of his world order that we are looking at, which is going to make so many of us who struggled against the Cold War feel maybe nostalgic for the old days when the checks and balances and countervailing forces afforded some protection against making third world people easy targets for shooting practice. Thank you very much.
According to Red Crescent Society, there has been 112,000 people killed, of which 60% are children. And no one knows this right now. No one wants to know. The news is out, it's all over the place, it's public information, people can get it from anywhere. The media is engaging in self-censorship, and the people don't want to know this. And we are here to get our message out to the people, that we are disgusted, we are horrified, and we want the people to know that we are angry. And unless they do something about this atrocious action in the Middle East, then the New World Order will feed a new form of Nazism. This is the beginning of a Holocaust, and the Americans are responsible for this. And we hold every taxpayer responsible until they cut down their taxes or do something that's really active about it.
My name is Iman Kishawi, and the reason I'm here tonight is I feel so helpless in this community. It's like I talk to people about this war and the horror of war, and nobody knows about it. It's this euphoria in this country that, okay, we won the war, it's one-sided, nobody thinks about the other side, and I don't care what it is, killing innocent people, or even, the way they were doing the carpet bombing and shelling the Iraqis in their bunkers. Those people are helpless. They have no air cover, they have no defense against all these horrifics that's been going on over there, and those people are helpless. They're just sitting targets. Even when they withdrew from Kuwait, when Saddam Hussein ordered them to withdraw from Kuwait, they were retreating, withdrawing, whatever they could call it. They were carpet bombing those people. Nobody knows how many people died in this incident alone.
The New World Order is Anglo-American deception to control the oil in the Gulf. And I think it's double standard for the United States to advocate for the 12 resolutions that has been adopted for the last 6 months, while there is resolution is for the past 40 years. When the expansion is stayed in Israel that occupies the Palestinian land. And that's hypocrisy. And at the same time, by the United States, for saying we don't allow linkage, it was the United States who put the linkage for the Cubans to leave Angola in order for South Africans to leave Namibia. It wasn't South African government who did it, it was the United States government. So I think that's hypocrisy.
Let me please introduce to you Sister Faye Williams.
I was indeed on the last flight out of Baghdad before Baghdad International was bombed. And I had just said a lot of teary farewells to a lot of wonderful people who are real, live human beings to me, not just targets. I repeatedly asked myself if I could have told my friends something that they could have taken to their leader as a message to say to them. George Bush will think nothing of crushing out your dreams and your aspirations. I know, for I know what he has done to African Americans. They want to get your leader into a war because getting rid of anybody who disagrees with them is what the New World Order is all about. And I was waiting for a change of planes in Paris. The bombs began to fall, and it was too late. So I didn't have to wonder any longer whether or not I had done all that I could do. We will never know if sanctions would have worked to force Saddam Hussein to do what George Bush had ordered him to do. What we do know is that in war, there are no winners, because war is inherently wrong no matter who drops the first bomb. In this case, George Bush quickly lost patience with America's former friend and rushed at a breathtaking speed to send 500,000 troops to the Gulf to prepare to bomb the Iraqis into submission. Even as, like a broken record, George Bush was on television every day and every night, proclaiming that he felt no animosity toward the Iraqi people. How cynical, George. How tragic. That must be a lot of comfort to the families of the civilians who died in Iraq. That must be a lot of comfort to those who are still dying from the path of destruction that the Allied forces left in Iraq, and the pain and suffering of so many who are associated with Iraq and many in the Arab world. From the time the first bomb dropped, I felt that a big piece of the soul of America had been diminished. And I know that I am one American who can never again feel a kinship with America's leaders, not the current leaders. I will never allow George Bush's enemies to be my enemies. Now it's up to us. It's up to what has been minimized as a handful of American people who believe in measuring human rights by one yardstick. It's up to us who may be referred to by our leaders today as peace terrorists, if you will. It's up to us to regain the soul of America. We must not allow what happened in Iraq to kill our spirits, my brothers and my sisters. We must not allow the Iraqi people to suffer alone. If we do, then the enemies of peace have won, and we might as well close up shop and go home. It's time instead for us to turn up the heat, to turn the spotlight on the United Nations hypocrisy and the United States hypocrisy and how we handle it. It's time for us to turn the spotlight on how we handle apartheid in South Africa. It's time for us to turn the spotlight on the annihilation of the Lebanese people. It's time for us to turn the spotlight on those poor freedom fighters in China and the people who are working for independence in the Baltic, and point out how differently George Bush handles them and how long it takes for him to get impatient with their oppressors. It's time for us to turn the spotlight on the brutal occupation of Palestine. It's time for us to turn the spotlight on the neglect and the oppression of African Americans and recent FBI harassment of Arab Americans. We must not allow fear to prevent us from disagreeing with the president, who was all too willing to risk the lives of those United States troops to be mercenaries for the rich and the powerful. Many of those same young people will be returning home soon, no doubt. They will find that the same commander-in-chief who sent them to fight for the rich and the powerful refused to sign a civil rights act that would have helped to give them an equal opportunity in this country. Those same troops will return home, and they will find a president who has lessened their chances of getting an equal education. So, my brothers and sisters, we must close ranks. We must speak out against UN and US complicity in condemning all occupations and annexations, including that of the West Bank and Gaza and their de facto annexation. Ironically, we can compare U.S. hypocrisy regarding occupations with the U.S. position on terrorism, where the United States opposes terrorists if they're not U.S.-sponsored terrorists. The whipping person, or the whipping boy, as some of you might say, used to be the communists around the world. Now it's the terrorists, especially those of us who are referred to as peace terrorists today, fail to understand that America is mobilized to counter any threat of peace anywhere in the world. But that's absolutely clear to me today. Meanwhile, the real terrorists like UNITA and the Contras get United States assistance and praise rather than the wrath of the United States. Sharon, Begin, and Shamir, who came to power as a result of their well-known terrorist activities, are rewarded not with millions, but with billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars and anything else they want to support their of Palestinian brothers and sisters. Even that sad fact, my brothers and sisters, must not kill your spirit. Despite the fact that Arab Americans, like African Americans, have more often than not been the victims, not the perpetrators of terrorism, we find the FBI having the audacity to go out and to question them. I need not remind you that Alex Oda was brutally murdered by the JDL more than 5 years ago. Why hasn't the FBI brought Alex's murderers to justice? It's called the double standard. According to ABC News, they live happily on expropriated Palestinian land in the West Bank. Why hasn't the FBI extradited his killers if the Israelis are such good friends and are so cooperative with us? We all know that the FBI's snatch program is very much in effect. And any time Bush or Baker wanted to claim to bring somebody from the West Bank or from Israel or from anywhere, they can do it. It's just a matter of will. If the FBI wanted a Palestinian American extradited from the West Bank, it would have been done sooner than it takes apprehending one of America's most wanted. From past experience, we know all too well the goal of FBI harassment of Arab Americans and of African Americans is to prevent us from exercising our constitutional rights to speak out. But we must not allow that to kill our spirit. We must continue to speak out. If you are intimidated, my brothers and my sisters, if you are traumatized into silence from your grief, if you don't participate in the political process, if you never call or write your member of Congress and act like you don't even know him or her, if you don't call or write your senators that you helped to elect, or your state legislators, or even your county or city councilors, then the enemies of truth, of justice, and equality will have won. Don't let them kill your spirit. We as a nation lose when we refuse to stand up and to challenge evil wherever we see it, no matter what the cost is. We cannot have fair weather friends. We must challenge our friends to be better than they sometimes want to be. We must give them the strength to stand up for what is right. Some of the first casualties of war are the American Constitution and the Bill of Rights, if you haven't noticed. Don't believe all the garbage that you've been hearing going on about this war and what led to this war. Your rights of free speech and the freedom to assemble mean nothing unless you exercise those rights. I need not remind you that even as we gather here today, you know all too well that nearly 2 million Palestinian brothers and sisters on the West Bank and Gaza suffer incredible hardships to secure food and the basic necessities of life. January 16th curfew compounded those problems for them. For the next 10-day period after that curfew, people were allowed only twice for a short period of time to try to purchase food and essentials. Is this proper behavior in George Bush's New World Order for America's so-called only democratic friend in the Middle East? Is this the behavior you and I as American taxpayers should repeatedly reward to the admitted tune of over $3 billion a year, and we know it's much more? In Gaza, we're told that during this curfew, only the women were allowed to leave their home, and that was for an inadequate amount of time. That curfew resulted in the disruption of health and medical services to those in the occupied territories. There was a shortage of medical supplies as well as an inability of those medical personnel who were needed to get to their places of work. We're told as much as 30% of the medical teams of 2 of the hospitals in the area were able to get to work. Preventive health care services, including prenatal programs, were disrupted. Residents, including pregnant Palestinian women, were fearful of retribution if they left their homes, so they stayed and they suffered. In some areas, we're told the curfew situation is said to be dangerous to the health of the people, where was the United Nations then? Where was the United States government then? On the other hand, breaking the curfew could result in a shoot to kill or imprisonment for up to 5 years and heavy financial fines. Is this to continue in Bush's New World Order? You better understand what the New World Order means for people like you and me. Is this something victims of the Holocaust would remain silent about? Or is this the kind of behavior which the world is still asked to condemn Adolf Hitler? The results of these constant curfews surely must have included increased miscarriages for our Palestinian sisters, mental retardation and physical handicaps for the babies, and premature and underdeveloped babies. Many of these same things and more are happening to Iraqi women and children, according to the World Health Organization today. We know that untold numbers of horror stories will occur before adequate health care will find its way to the Iraqi women and children. It's time for us to close ranks around one another, to regroup and to fight on until victory. I thank you. God bless you, and I love you.
I felt very sad when the war broke out. Of course, we've had problems in our own country. We had our own war going on in the streets of America and in the human services and throughout all of the institutions of our nation, education, the banking institutions, and here we have another war that we couldn't even begin to think about dealing with against people whom I had become to feel were my own family. And I was terribly troubled. And I had been telling my family for decades that this kind of thing was going to happen because I've been looking at the headlines of Time magazine and the various media, that there was a game plan behind our attitudes. And I became very troubled and very depressed and extremely bitter about having to pay taxes for a society that so misrepresents what I feel, the majority of the American people. I do not believe the majority of the American people want the blood of the Iraqi people on their hands for whatever reasons. I simply cannot believe that. And if it's true that 86% of Americans support the war, and support the killing of people they know absolutely nothing about, then truly I have to leave. And I don't feel that I can leave my family behind in a country that is so dangerous.
Hi, my name is Munir Azam, and the reason that I'm at this particular event is because I am of Palestinian descent, and so that makes me an Arab American. And from my opinion, that gives me two reasons essentially to be embarrassed by the events that have gone in the Gulf. I am somewhat upset from my Arabic background in the sense that the Arabs have been unable to unify, and there have been the aspect of the Arab nations that have, as the Professor Aruri had said, that are willing to take bakshish in sacrifice their culture and their background in the unity of the Arab culture. And from the other end, from the American standpoint, I am extremely embarrassed by our complete lack of understanding and willingness to allow or to promote a even-handed policy in that area.
As someone who's in the peace movement and is looking at a population in this country that seems to think that the war is over needs to say to itself, this has been a great human tragedy, and we need to look at the war which is actually going to begin now, the new war against Palestinian people all around the world. In addition to the hundreds of thousands of Iraqi people, families who've lost loved ones and have had their towns, their water supplies, their medical supplies destroyed as a result of U.S. policy. So with regard to the war, I ask people to consider what forms our vital interest as people in this country. Is it in our vital interest to carry out the war which we just did? Or is it in our vital interest to stand up for people who are fighting against oppression, and to stand up for the rights of people not to have to face big stick Americanism and patriotism and the attitude of the United States government among other governments, that they have the right because of their superior military force to go around and claim the world's resources and just ignore standard protocol for resolving disputes. So
please welcome Susan Akram.
By now you've all heard of incidents of harassment, violence, or threats against Arab Americans occurring over the last 6 months. Recorded incidents of anti-Arab violence brought on by the Gulf War hysteria range from individual harassment and discrimination by employers to actual physical violence or destruction of Arab-owned property. You may have heard of the many bomb threats, particularly against Islamic centers and mosques around the country. You may have heard of the fire bombings of American Arab-owned businesses, particularly in the Detroit area, or of the home of an Arab American family in New Jersey that was burned down. Or, and perhaps most chilling of all, you may have heard of Arab Americans who have been questioned by the FBI, or you yourself may have been interviewed by an agent of that agency. Whether these incidents affected you or your family personally, or whether you heard of them word of mouth, they have no doubt been extremely frightening. Why the sudden rise in violence and intimidation against Arab Americans in this country? Can it be completely explained by the war in the Persian Gulf? Or are there more sinister reasons for this surge of animosity against persons of Arab origin? I would like to focus on just a few possible explanations for the recent rise in anti-Arab racism or hysteria. But I'd like to focus primarily on actions taken by the federal government and agencies that seem to me to have unleashed hysteria against the Arab and Arab American community. I want to focus first and foremost on federal legislation and federal agency activities that target Arab Americans and persons active in Arab nationalist causes for harassment and sometimes criminal prosecution or punishment. And what I have to say may be somewhat of a surprise to most of you. Let me begin with the infamous immigration legislation, the McCarran-Walter Act, passed in 1952. This act allows exclusion or deportation of aliens based merely on membership or affiliation with organizations that, among other things, advocate communism or advocate the unlawful destruction of property. For an alien to be deportable under this act, she need only be associated with such an organization, not necessarily, again, with any of the prescribed aims of the organization. Just affiliation with such an organization is enough. Why is this legislation particularly threatening to U.S. residents of Arab origin? Because it has been used to target for exclusion or deportation persons affiliated with the PLO.
As long as there is U.S. domination and occupation, there is no ceasefire, and a war still remains in that part of the world. Yes, today, all of us are heavy-hearted. Yes, today, our pains ache. Yes, Selma, I with you, my heart aches and my tears come down, as do all the other mothers and families across this world who are so torn apart by the death and destruction and the killings of thousands and thousands and thousands of innocent civilians in Iraq. Yes, we cannot forget the pictures of the charcoal bodies carried out from the civilian bunkers, of women and children not being able to identify them. And today, on this day, we are reaffirming our commitment to the struggle for peace and justice. We are joining together to say that we are not going to stop this struggle until we do achieve our goal of liberation. Today, sisters and brothers, in the name of the great leader, the apostle of peace, I say we must continue to speak out, because as the great Martin Luther King said, if we do not speak out, it will certainly be a form of betrayal. My sister Faye, and before him my brother Nasir Aruri, did speak out about the injustices. And I salute you for your truth and your honesty, because the media didn't have enough honesty in it to speak out and to tell the truth to the American people. Tonight we are speaking out about this policy that we do not agree with. A policy not to the interest of the American people, nor to the interest of the Arab people in the region. Yes, there is a linkage and there is a bondage between occupation in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, between apartheid in South Africa, between the death squads in Central America, and yes, between the killings and the homelessness right here in the United States of America. We realize that this policy has brought to the Palestinian people to be the victims of this policy. I'm going to close very quickly. I would just like you to listen carefully to what I have to say now. Yes, victims, the Palestinian people, as my sister has told you, for the past 40 days, since January 16th, Palestinians have been under a blanket curfew in the occupied territories. Yes, Palestinians have been prisoners in their homes. Yes, Palestinians have been starved in their homes. And yesterday, Mr. Bernstein revealed on Pacifica Radio a new contingency plan which the Pentagon has put out, which is still considered unclassified. This new contingency plan says that Palestinians in Kuwait will be treated as the following: put in concentration camps, gathered together, a part of them. Another part of them will be expelled out of the country. Another tried, and another exchanged for Egyptian migrant workers. Yes, the victims politically, yes, the victims physically of this war, of this tragedy. And under occupation, as I told you, the curfew remains. During this period, yes, refugee camps and people have been starving. During this period, yes, people have been shot on sight for breaking the curfew to go out to get items just to sustain their livelihood. Yes, the U.S.-funded Israeli policy is to starve the Palestinian livelihood into subjugation.
George Bush is grown up, and he should know better than to just start a war.
Good evening. What we've just been watching are excerpts from an evening of Arab American politics and culture held March 2nd in Cambridge, Massachusetts. We hope you've enjoyed this alternative perspective on the American role in the Middle East. Tune in again next week for another episode of Dead Air Live. Thank you. Good night.